Well, thank you for joining me again this evening as we continue on moving towards your commissioning as Stephen ministers. This will be the lecture portion of the assignment on Module 3, The Art of Listening. The part that I will be giving you tonight via video will be sections 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7 in your manual. Sections 2 and 4 will be handled as in-class assignments. When you meet in group time, we'll work through some various role plays or exercises at that point. So again, tonight, as you listen to this, will be sections 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7 as you follow along in your manual. I would also encourage, if you have not done the pre-class reading at this point, I would go ahead and stop the tape right now. Spend some time reading pages 51 through 58 in your Stephen Ministry Manual, which is the pre-class assignment reading for this section on listening. I think it'll set a great tone for what you're going to hear, and maybe some of the concepts that will come across will follow along a little bit easier after you've done that. So if you have not done the pre-class reading, go ahead and take time to do that now, and then we'll pick up with the lecture point at that time. Well, have you ever wondered what God does in the heavens? What does our Maker do? The one who created the heavens and the earth. He's omnipotent. He's almighty. He breathed life into the man. He created everything. What does he do with his time? Well, to me, I think one of the great attributes, one of the key attributes that God has, is he listens to us. The book of Exodus talks about during that long period, the Israelites groaned in their slavery and they cried out for help because of the slavery they were in, and that went up to God. God heard that. He remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. He says that in Exodus 2. Later in Exodus, after the Lord delivered the Israelites from Egypt, he said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites." The psalmist wrote, "God has surely listened and heard my voice in prayer." That's in Psalm 66:19. When Jesus stood before Lazarus' tomb, ready to raise Lazarus, who had been dead for 4 days, he looked up and he said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me," but said this for the benefit of those people who were standing around him, that they may believe that you sent me. God listened to people in the Bible, and he also listens to us. He hears us when we struggle and when we cry out. He hears our prayers. He hears our thanksgiving. He hears our praise, our supplications, and he hears our laments. He even hears the unspoken communication that many times we have with God. Through his prophet Isaiah, God said, "Before they call, I will answer. While they are still speaking, I will hear." Your pre-class reading, that I hope you have now done, showed that listening is more than just dispassionately hearing. Real listeners get involved. They empathize. They share their care receiver's journey. That's the kind of listener that God is too. He became one of us. He knows exactly what it is to live our lives and face the challenges and face the temptations that we face day to day. And in Jesus, God has responded to all he hears, to our prayers, to our questions, to our cries for mercy, to our complaints, and to our pain. He listens, and he has answered us once and for all time by sending his Son to die and rise for us, that whoever believes in him would not perish, but have everlasting life. In the Bible passage that you see at the top of page 51, James also commends that we be listeners, quick to listen, slow to speak. Now that may not seem like much. We may wish we could rush in and solve every problem that our care receivers may have with just wise words that we have. We wish we could solve that. Instead, however, we look to God for the example in James' words that it is better to listen, to enter into another's pain, to understand. After much listening, our few words will tend to be more wise and more compassionate. And you know what? The wonderful surprise is that God works through our caring listening like a soothing salve works on a wound, bringing about healing, deeper self-understanding, and the abundant life that Jesus promised. I want to open our time in prayer and then we're going to move to an exercise. Simple true, false questions, but I want you to work through them with me. So open with me in prayer. Lord, we pour out our hearts to you in praise, in sorrow, in need, in thanksgiving, and you're always there for us, listening, caring, soothing, and healing. Give us the patience, compassion, and skill we need to follow your example and to be good listeners. Bless us through this time of learning. Use it to equip us to listen well. Give us opportunities to listen to one another and to use our care for one another to build bonds of Christian love between each one of us. Thank you for hearing our prayer and for answering it. And we pray this in your name. Amen. All right, so skipping over then in your manual to part 3, which is the listening facts quiz. On page 52 and 53 of your training manual, you're going to see that quiz. Now, this is not meant to be a high-pressure test. I think once you get into it, you will see that is not the case. They're gimmies. They're layups. You know, no one's going to know what you answer to these questions unless you choose to share your answers at some point. But the value and purpose in it is to give us an opportunity to really talk about some of the important factors that go into listening. So take just a moment now and begin to fill out those questions 1 through 10 by putting a check mark by true or false. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do that. You can pause the tape if you'd like. And then once you've answered those questions 1 through 10, I want to just spend a couple of minutes walking through those with you. All right, so question 1 that you had. If you were having a hard time hearing your care receiver due to the noise around you, you should listen harder, because it would be rude to interrupt the care receiver and suggest a quieter setting. What'd you come up with on that one? I would hope maybe the answer is false. If interruptions or noise keep you from hearing your care receiver, the best thing to do is find a quieter place where you can have that visit. It's not rude to do that, but instead of interrupting, you may want to wait until your care receiver takes a pause in their comments, and then you suggest a move to a different location. Now, this is one that's near and dear to my heart, simply because I don't hear well out of my right ear, and when I tend to be in places where there's other peripheral noise, you know, a Starbucks or a restaurant or somewhere like that, very difficult for me to hear or to focus on what someone's saying because I got a lot going on in this ear. You may find the same situations. Find the best place, the quietest place, the most conducive place to listening that you can. Now, aside from that, what might be some other times when it would make sense to find a different place in which to continue the visit? Some of the things I think of is you could be overheard depending on where you meet. If you opt to meet somewhere like a Starbucks, we're going to talk about confidentiality in several weeks, but confidentiality could be compromised if you're in an environment where you're speaking and you don't want the person in the table next to you to hear what that conversation is about. It may be necessary to move to a different location. Obviously, confidentiality is one of the key factors in effective Stephen ministry. We owe that to our care receivers, and we promise that in all the literature we deliver, that it is a confidential one-to-one ministry. When the location of your caring visit becomes possibly dangerous, you would want to go to a different place in order to do your visit. Finally, when the care receiver seems uncomfortable with the location, that might be an opportunity to move the location. There may be a reason that as you meet with that care receiver, it could be a coffee shop where they had a relationship with a loved one that they're no longer seeing, or perhaps that loved one has died, but that particular location brings up memories of that, so therefore that becomes an awkward place in which to meet. So those are just a couple of options of places why you might move a location, aside from just not being able to hear. Second question, long silences are destructive to caring listening and tend to erode the care receiver's trust in the Stephen minister. True or false? False is, I hope, the answer you came up with. In fact, long silences can be some of the most productive times in a caring conversation. People might think that silence is just an awkward time when neither person can think of anything to say. And while that might be true sometimes, it's also a time when perhaps the care receiver is thinking, they're processing, they're going through some deep thoughts on the topic, trying to come to a place where they're going to make an insight to you. Stephen Minister may also be thinking deeply about the person's words or actions. So there's nothing necessarily awkward about long silences. They can be very healthy. Now, one of the exercises that we've done in class before, I had folks in the class close their eyes, and I put a stopwatch on them. And I said, raise your hand when you think that 1 minute has passed. So they closed their eyes, and I started the stopwatch. And you may or may not be surprised, but the very first hand went in the air that they felt like 1 minute had elapsed at 30 seconds. A few more hands went up around the 40-second mark, a few more around 50, and then there was actually one that went up at about 1:20. But for the most part, people raised their hands much quicker than a minute, which tells me that many times you may think a silence is longer than it is. So don't be afraid of those awkward moments of silence, because they can be a great moment for just recouping thoughts and putting thoughts together. Question 3, sometimes you will learn more about your care receiver's thoughts and feelings by his or her tone of voice or body language than you will from the actual words. That is true. Now, that is not always the case, but many times a person will communicate much more to you through the tone of their voice, through body language, than necessarily by words. For example, a person who says everything is fine, but they're doing this, yeah, everything's fine. They're telling you that not everything is fine, but it's also telling you that they need to face up to the reality of what their feelings are at that moment. What are some of the other examples that people may communicate through body language or tone of voice than actual words? Someone may get up and walk out of the room without saying a word. Obviously, that would convey something. A person who is crying but saying that nothing is wrong would convey to you through actions that something is indeed wrong. A person makes a fist and says, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Or a person glaring at you with a deep frown or scowl on their face. Those are all movements, motions, body language, actions that may tell you more about someone than just the words that are coming out of the mouth. Number 4, it would be valuable to mentally review previous conversations you've had with your care receiver before each caring visit. The answer to that is indeed true. A mental review will help you listen over time and note any changes in what the care receiver says or the way in which they say it. You might want to just pause and think, can you think of a time when you learned something important about someone by listening to them over the course of time? Question number 5, active listening means carrying on a conversation while you are jogging or doing aerobics. The answer to that is false. Active listening is a way of listening to the whole person in order to understand him or her as well as possible and to help that person understand him or herself as well as possible. What part of you is the most active when you do active listening? Well, it could indeed be the ears. It could indeed be eyes. It could be your brain. Or it could be your heart. So there's a number of ways to do active listening. Question number 6, an open-ended question is one for which there simply is no answer. The answer to that is false. An open-ended question is one that requires an essay-style response versus a single-word response, yes or no, or one-word response. Open-ended questions encourage a care receiver to say more about the situation and to say more about their particular thoughts and feelings. The opposite of an open-ended question is a closed-end question, and that can be answered with just a few words. Do clarifying questions work better when they are open-ended or closed-ended? Now, a clarifying question is one that's going to bring obviously more clarity to a situation. It can be open or closed-ended. Open-ended questions, however, will encourage the care receiver to open up and say more. Number 7, questions that begin with the word why can make people feel defensive. True or false? The answer is true. The word why does seem to put people on the defensive many times. Why questions require people to justify what they've been thinking or what they may have been feeling. Questions that begin with what or how is it are taken as a lot gentler and more caring. Why do you ask so many questions? Well, that's not a real question. That's just meant to demonstrate that point. Number 8, when it comes to reflecting, a tape recorder or a parrot could do just as good a job as a Stephen minister. Boy, I certainly hope not. The answer to that is false. When you reflect, you are not just repeating back or parroting the other person's exact words. You're summarizing what you believe to be the person is thinking or feeling, and you use your own words in which to reflect that. Have any of you ever had the annoying experience of having someone parrot your words back to you? And if so, how did that make you feel? Number 9, when you do reflective listening, it is a good practice to use a number of different lead-ins rather than always beginning with a statement such as, "What I hear you saying is... True or false?" The answer is true. If you get stuck in a rut using the same lead-in all the time, it may come off sounding as if you're playing a game or you're following some type of rigid formula instead of really truly listening. And furthermore, your care receiver is going to quickly get tired of hearing you say the same phrase again and again. What lead-ins feel comfortable to you when you do reflective listening? You may want to think through that. There's some different lead-ins. You can look at reference box Q and see some of those reflecting responses on page 48 in your pre-class reading. So it'd be a good time now to look back at page 48, reference box Q. It gives you just an example of several different type lead-ins rather than "what I hear you saying is" over and over and over. And finally, number 10, reflecting spiritual concerns is a way to force people to admit that they need a Savior. True or false? And the answer would be false. Reflective listening is a way to invite your care receiver to say more about his or her thoughts, feelings, and yes, spiritual concerns. If you try to force someone to talk about something as deeply personal as his or her spiritual concerns, it's likely that he or she will soon stop trusting you. And you may want to, in your own time there, think of a time when it helped you to talk with another person about a spiritual concern that you had. All right, so we're going to move on over now to section 5, which is the Caregiver's Compass Review. And again, we will spend most every week some time talking about this Caregiver's Compass and just kind of reinforcing some of the things that are there. So as you look at this Caregiver's Compass, it's on page 54 in your manual. Again, as a reminder, you've got the chi and the rho at the center of it. And then around the 4 different points of the compass, you've got compassionate, full of faith, skilled, and trustworthy, being the 4 points of the compass. So what I'm going to ask you to do is just take a moment, pause the video, and as you think back through some of the things that we've talked about in this session on listening and the art of listening, put down some words, put down some phrases around that compass in the space that's provided at that compass. At the top where the word compassionate is, put a couple of phrases in there. How do you use compassionate as a part of listening? How do you make your listening be more compassionate? So fill in those boxes there, and then to the right, as you see the full of faith words, what do you think of when we talk about this lesson, the art of listening, that requires you to be full of faith and then skilled? What things do you do in your listening that are skillful practices? And then finally, on the trustworthy side of the compass to your left, how do trustworthy and some of the things that we've talked about tonight go hand in hand? So kind of fill in that compass around there. I think that's a great exercise to just keep the 4 points of that compass in mind, and as a review for some of the things that we've talked about. Moving to number 6, which is looking ahead to future weeks. You know, this has been one of the great weeks where we talk about listening, because it's one of the most important things you will ever do as a Stephen minister. You're going to use your listening skills in every caregiving relationship that you have. And as we move on to future topics along the way, you're going to find that what you learned in this module will continue to pop up again and again. From whether that is process versus results, which is coming in a couple of weeks, or whether it's helping suicidal persons get the help they need, which is coming much later in the semester, you're always going to be honing your skills as a caring listener. Now, your reading assignment for the next time that we get together is going to be the book Christian Caregiving, A Way of Life. You're going to read chapters 14 through 20, which is pages 118 through 157. I'd like you to have that book handy when we meet again. Have that with you on the couch there, wherever you're listening from. Bring the book. Finally, point number 7, listening to God as we conclude this week's topic. You know, it's great to listen to your care receiver. We've got to do that. That, again, as I've said, one of the most important skills that we'll ever have as an effective Stephen minister is listening. But listening to God is even more important than listening to that care receiver that you have. It's a skill that we always want to continue to improve and hone. And it's valuable not only to us as Stephen ministers, but in every facet of our life, as parents, as spouses, as bosses, employees, teachers, neighbors, citizens. Everything we do, we can be better listeners. So as we become better listeners, I think we do become better disciples. Think about applying what you've learned in this module to listening to God. We can show our love for God by paying attention. We can work to hear God's messages truly, to think about them, to pay attention to the thoughts, the feelings, the spiritual concerns that God's communication brings up in us. We can carefully consider our response to what we hear from God, responding not only as living obedient disciples, but also by communicating our love to God as our Savior, our friend, and as our closest confidant. By His death and resurrection, Jesus made it possible for us to have that relationship with God that is characterized by love, devotion, and communication. One of the best ways we can work on that relationship from our end is to listen to God in the ways in which we've learned in this module. So I want you to take a few minutes and just pay attention to God. There's 4 Bible passages that you'll find in your manual at this point. They're written out in Focus Note 5, beginning on page 55. And then at the end of the Focus Note, you're going to find 3 questions. The 3 questions are: what content is God sharing? What feelings is God sharing? And what spiritual concerns is God sharing? Choose one of the passages, read it, pay attention to what God is saying to you. Think about that passage as you read each one of the questions. And you can take several minutes to do that. I would even encourage you, because this is an exercise that you're going to do outside of classroom time that we have. This is something you can do in the quiet of your home. Read all those passages. Don't just pick one and do it. But read through Psalm 46, God is our refuge and our strength. Read through Isaiah 40, 25 through 31. Read through Matthew 6, 25 through 34. And the beautiful passage in Romans 8, one of the richest chapters in the Bible. Read through all 4 of those passages and just spend a little time as your devotional time thinking on and dwelling on what content is God sharing with me through His Word here. What feelings is God sharing? And finally, what spiritual concerns is God sharing? And so do that to conclude your time tonight. Let me pray for you as we close. This is a prayer that is in the book here. I am not so much freelancing the prayer. I want to read it to you just as a blessing to you as we close this, because it really focuses in on all the things we've talked about tonight. Incline your ear, O Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. Preserve my life, for I am devoted to you. Save your servant who trusts in you. You are my God. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for to you do I cry all day long. Gladden the soul of your servant, for to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. For you, O Lord, are good and forgiving, abundant in steadfast love to all who call on you. Give ear, O Lord, to my prayer. Listen to my cry of supplication. In the day of my trouble, I call on you, for you will answer me. Psalm 86, 1 through 7. Lord, teach us to listen to you and to respond to what we hear with praise and with humble servant. Thank you for joining me tonight for this. I look forward to seeing you on the next video as we look at Module 4.